As a thick fog blanketed the lonely trails of Oakwood Park, far beyond the reach of any street lamp's glow, a resilient creature moved forward on calloused paws. Dust clung to its back, but its eyes never lost their determination. It was a German shepherd. Collarless, companionless, yet every step it took carried something more than survival, a will that refused to surrender. Its ash-gray coat, once likely sleek and proud, was now matted with cold mud and rain. But its eyes, alert, clear and searching, looked not for food or shelter, but for something more vital. It wasn't simply wandering. It was listening, with a sense honed somewhere between mankind's battlefields and an animal's raw instinct to live. That night, the wind rose from the lake and sliced through the trees like the forest's own weary sighs. Then a strange sound broke through the underbrush, a faint gasp, nearly a dying whisper asking for help. The dog froze. Its pointed ears stood tall like antennas catching the frequency of pain. Slowly, cautiously, it stepped forward, weaving through the undergrowth and swaying in the dim moonlight. And then, it saw her. A young woman lay on her side beneath a great oak, chained to its trunk by a cold steel cable. Her pale skin nearly melted into the gray bark, her tangled hair spread around her like wild grass, and her body trembled with each wave of cold that sliced through her flesh. Her shirt was torn, her legs were bruised, her fingers, purple and curled, clung to the last threads of consciousness. The dog didn't bark. It stood silently, watching her as if trying to understand who she was, where she came from, and why she'd been left here. Then, after a few seconds that seemed to carry the weight of an entire life, it stepped forward and gently touched her hand with its nose, a gesture soft as a whisper from the breathing world. Claire Bennett, 26, didn't open her eyes, but when the dog's nose met her skin, her lips moved ever so slightly. No one could tell what she said, but whatever it was, it found its way to the heart of the four-legged creature beside her. And then, for the first time in its long, silent journey, the dog barked. It rang out, sharp, urgent, cutting through the fog like a flare. It wasn't a bark of threat or warning, but a signal, as if the dog were saying, "I've found her. Is anyone out there? Come, now." It barked again, and again. Each time it was louder, more desperate. Its posture was silent yet unyielding, shielding the unconscious girl from the wind, its eyes never leaving her face, the eyes of a warrior without a battlefield, who had now found a mission worth more than any command from a human. No one knew how far it had traveled, how it had survived, or why it arrived here at the exact moment it was needed. But in that moment, the dog was no longer abandoned. It was a guardian, a flicker of light in suffocating darkness, a hand stretched out from the edge of despair. And when hurried footsteps echoed in the distance, when the breath of someone running toward that bark reached the trees, the dog didn't move. It kept its eyes fixed on the woman it had found in the shadows. The bark echoed through the air like a great crack, splitting the freezing fog that smothered Oakwood Park. Here, the sound was swallowed by thick trees and damp trails few dared to walk. From far off, near the curve of the lake, Emily Hayes, a young social worker out for a morning jog, came to an abrupt stop. Her canvas shoes were soaked from fallen leaves, but she didn't care. There was something in that sound that made her heartbeat skip, then spike with a feeling she couldn't name. She pulled out her earbuds and tilted her head. The bark came again, not the confused yelp of a lost dog, nor a threatening warning. It was a cry, compressed and forceful from somewhere deep, like someone was trying to say, "This matters, please listen." Others might have dismissed it as a wild dog howling in the woods, but Emily, who had spent 5 years working with abused children and survivors of domestic violence, could not ignore the feeling growing inside her. Without hesitation, she turned down a narrow path leading into the thicker forest. Each step is driven by something beyond logic. Then, as she passed through a ring of old oaks with roots like giant arms reaching out from the earth. She stopped cold. In front of her was a scene she could barely believe. Beneath a large tree, cloaked in damp moss, lay a young woman, chained to the trunk with a length of cold metal. Her clothes were torn, her limbs bruised, and her body curled as if trying to shield itself from a bone-deep chill. Her hair was tangled and spread across her face, lips dry and nearly colorless. But what froze Emily wasn't just the woman's broken state. It was the figure standing beside her. A German shepherd, body covered in dust, dried mud, and streaks of old cuts. The dog showed no aggression. It simply stood there, eyes locked on the unconscious woman. Its coat, once likely stunning with the breed's signature gray and black tones, was now dirty and tangled. But its presence was unmistakable. Dignified, calm, alert. The way it stayed close, blocking the wind, guarding her, never moving away, told Emily all she needed to know. It wasn't here by chance. It had found her, and it wasn't going to leave. Emily froze for a second, then dropped to her knees beside Claire. Her hands trembled as she placed 2 fingers on the icy wrist. The pulse was faint, fragile as a thread. She didn't need medical training to know that a few more minutes would have meant the end. A life lost deep in the woods, with no name, no witnesses. Fumbling, she pulled out her phone and called emergency services, her fingers shaking. Meanwhile, the dog barked again, lower this time but clearer. A nudge. "Hurry! She's barely holding on." "It's okay, I'm here," Emily murmured. To herself, to the woman, to the dog. She took off her jacket, gently laid it over the freezing body, and then wrapped her scarf around Claire's hands. The dog watched every move, not with suspicion but with deep, deliberate awareness, as if weighing whether this human could be trusted with what it had protected. At last, the dog stepped closer and softly nudged Claire's hand, an act of gentle care. Emily nearly cried. In all her years in social work, she had seen violence, cruelty, and hopelessness. But never had she seen an animal, abandoned, hurt, and wandering, carry such an intact, selfless heart. As the ambulance finally turned into the main path, its yellow lights cutting through the mist, Emily stood and waved. Then she knelt and whispered to the dog, "You're not going anywhere. He stays. I won't let anyone separate you. I promise." And, strangely, the dog, still unnamed, sat down beside Claire, placing its front paws close to her side as if confirming that her words were true. There was no fear in its eyes. Only one purpose left to fulfill: to protect the woman it had never met but chose not to leave. When the medics rushed over and tried to move the dog away, Emily stepped between them. "Don't! That dog is the reason she's alive." They looked surprised, but when the beam of their flashlight caught the dog's eyes, they understood. This was no ordinary stray. It was the first soul to hear a silent cry for help, the first to believe someone still deserved to be found, and for the first time in years, Emily felt something stir inside her chest. Belief. When the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped off into the early, not yet bright morning, Emily sat in the back, clutching Claire's cold foot. Beside her, the German shepherd, whose name she still didn't know, lay silently pressed against her, eyes unblinking. It didn't look at anyone, didn't react to the siren, didn't panic in the confined space. It simply stayed close to Claire, as if that was the only place it was allowed to exist. And when the sterile white lights of the hospital replaced the misty shadows of the forest, it was still there. Claire was rushed into the emergency room, where the doctors quickly took over. But only a few hours later, a nurse hurried out to the hallway where Emily waited, worry etched across her face. She's awake, but she's not saying a word. Her mother's inside, but she isn't responding to anything. Emily followed quickly, her heart sinking further with each step. She panics when she sees strangers. Her heart races, breathing irregularly. She avoids eye contact, even with her mother. The door to the room stood slightly ajar. Inside, Amanda, a woman in her early 40s, face haggard with worry, sat beside her daughter, holding her hand. But Claire gently pulled away, her gaze drifting, as if she didn't recognize or couldn't bear to acknowledge her mother's presence. Claire's eyes were open but vacant, and her body flinched every time a nurse approached. No words, no strong movements, just a suffocating tension in the air, thick like fog before a storm. Emily stepped beside Amanda and whispered, "I think I know what might help." And then, when Shadow, that's what Emily had started calling the dog, was gently led in on a soft leash, the room stilled. The dog moved slowly, scanning each face, then headed straight to Claire's bed. No one needed to guide him. He already knew where to go. Claire didn't look up at first, but when Shadow's paws made their soft, familiar sound on the floor near the edge of the bed, her eyes squeezed shut, then opened again, and for the first time since regaining consciousness, she turned her head slowly. Her clouded eyes met Shadow's bright ones. Not a bark, not a sound. The dog simply sat, pressing his body against the bed, lowering his head but keeping his gaze locked on her face. And with that, Claire began to breathe more slowly. Amanda choked back a sob. The doctors exchanged silent glances. No one needed to check her vitals. They could tell her body was stabilizing. Claire stared at Shadow for a long, long time, then slowly let her hand drop toward the edge of the bed. It was unclear what she was reaching for, but in that instant, Shadow's nose met her trembling fingers. Claire immediately gripped them, as if clinging to the only lifeline left in her sea of panic. Emily had to look away, eyes burning. Amanda covered her mouth. The entire room froze in that sacred moment. A woman who had been left behind in the woods was finding life again through the eyes of an unnamed animal. In the days that followed, Claire still didn't speak. Whenever a doctor entered the room, she recoiled, avoiding the light, never answering questions. But if Shadow was there, she remained grounded. They began calling him the only key to the closed-off world she now lived in. A young psychologist named Lara was brought in to support Claire's mental recovery. She quietly observed each session, taking extensive notes. But what truly captured her attention was Shadow's behavior. He responded with remarkable sensitivity to Claire's emotions. When she was anxious, he barked softly, as if to reassure her. When she startled, he moved closer, not touching her, but near enough so she knew she wasn't alone. Most astonishingly, when Lara tested various tones while saying Claire, Shadow only reacted positively to gentle voices, without command or doubt. Shadow wasn't just a trained dog. He was a being that could discern emotions, sense threat versus safety, and most of all, know exactly who needed him most. One late afternoon, after a full-body scan of Claire, the results stunned the medical team. In addition to the bruises and scrapes from being chained to a tree, Claire bore numerous older injuries: old rib fractures, pooled blood and soft tissue near her hip, and signs of past blunt force trauma left untreated. Lara stared at the scans, a lump in her throat. These wounds weren't from an accident. No one falls the same way repeatedly. No one accidentally inflicts a long scar behind their shoulder. Claire had been abused, silently, for a very long time. And now she was the only survivor, left with fragments of broken memories that only one being could begin to piece together: Shadow. The moment the scans revealed Claire's old, unexplained injuries, the atmosphere in her hospital room turned heavy. Claire still hadn't spoken a word, but her constant withdrawal, her terrified glances whenever anyone approached, and her unbreakable bond with Shadow spoke volumes. Yet what haunted Emily most was Amanda's expression every time she saw her daughter flinch. It wasn't the heartbreak of a mother realizing her child had endured too much. It was confusion, tinged with impatience. That day, Amanda entered the room with a bouquet of bright flowers and a strained smile. Shadow was lying with his head resting on Claire's legs, eyes instantly alert and trained on the door as soon as he heard Amanda's heels. Claire didn't turn to look at her. Instead, she pulled her hand to her chest and buried her face deeper into Shadow's neck fur, as if seeking shelter. Emily sat quietly in the corner, observing. Amanda sighed, set the flowers down, and turned to Lara. Claire's always been overly sensitive. Even loud noises used to scare her as a kid. I tried everything, but she was always more fragile than other children. And as she got older, she just closed herself off. Maybe all these reactions are just psychological. Her voice was gentle, but it painted Claire's sensitivity as a defect, something broken. Shadow immediately lifted his head, ears sharp, eyes narrowed. He didn't growl or act aggressively, but Emily, who had spent years studying therapy animals, recognized the signal instantly. Shadow didn't trust this woman, and he didn't hide it. Lara tactfully suggested Amanda let Claire rest. Amanda lingered a few minutes more, occasionally placing a hand on Claire's shoulder, whispering things no one else could hear. But whatever she said, each whisper made Claire shrink further, her grip on Shadow's fur tightening like someone clinging to the last lifeline in a rising tide. Later that afternoon, just after the rain broke and sunlight began peeking through, Ryan, the stepfather Amanda had mentioned a few times, arrived at the hospital. He wore a dark suit, a perfectly folded pocket square, and cologne so strong it gave Emily a mild headache as he passed in the hallway. From the moment he entered, Ryan didn't ask about her medical condition, didn't ask how she was feeling. He strode directly into the room, sat with quiet authority, and gestured for the nurse to step aside. His voice, perhaps trying to sound soft, still carried an undertone of command. "Claire, you need to talk to the doctor. Everyone's just trying to help. They can't do anything if you stay silent. Do you understand?" Claire didn't look at him. She curled tighter into Shadow, nearly disappearing behind his large body. But then something happened. Shadow growled. Not loud, not aggressive, but now from deep in his throat, clear and unmistakable, a warning. "Stop." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Who let this dog in here?" Emily's voice came from behind, calm but firm. "I did. He's the reason Claire is still alive. He hasn't left her side since we found her in the park. He's the only thing keeping her calm." Ryan opened his mouth to reply, but paused at Shadow's steady, unblinking stare. And Emily saw it, the flicker of discomfort. Not from the dog itself, but from something Ryan couldn't control. That night, Emily sat in the nurse's lounge with her notebook open. Officially, she was brought in as temporary psychological support, but her instincts and years working with survivors of abuse told her something wasn't right. A woman chained in a public park during winter, left to die. No robbery, no assault, but many old injuries. And that stepfather, along with a mother who either couldn't see the truth or chose not to. She glanced through the glass into Claire's room. Shadow lay on the floor, head resting on Claire's legs. His eyes are still open. He wasn't sleeping. He was standing guard, and that watchfulness spoke louder than any testimony. Emily drew a deep breath. Claire might not be able to speak yet, but she wasn't alone. The darkness behind that door wouldn't consume her, so long as that gaze remained beside her. A gaze that had not once looked away since the very first moment in the woods. Emily barely slept that night. The image of Ryan, the composed stepfather with unreadable eyes, kept replaying in her mind, along with the low, rumbling growl from Shadow echoing in her ears like an alarm bell. No dog growls like that out of instinct alone. That sound came from memory, a reflex born of experience. Shadow had seen something in Ryan that humans hadn't yet recognized. The next morning, while Claire was temporarily moved to a quieter area for observation, Emily took the chance to get Shadow checked. No one knew anything concrete about him, only that he had emerged from the darkness and hadn't left Claire's side since. But in his eyes, in the way he moved, observed, and reacted, Emily saw the signs of training. She brought him to the hospital's veterinary unit for a chip scan. The young vet raised an eyebrow as the scanner beeped. "There's a chip, a special type, used in canine units or advanced working dog programs. One moment, please." Emily stood with her hand resting gently on Shadow's back. The dog remained still, entirely unbothered. He didn't look at the vet. Instead, his eyes stayed on the door, as if instinct told him something important was near. A few minutes later, the vet returned holding a printout. Registered name? Shadow. Breed? Black German Shepherd. Male, born in 2020, trained in a state-run canine program. Last registered handler? Marcus Reilly. The name meant nothing at first. But when Emily searched through the specialized law enforcement database, the results made her freeze. Marcus Reilly, former K-9 trainer for the Halston County Police Department, was discharged from the force 3 years ago after an internal incident. The report lacked details and was read only. Loss of control during training, resulting in permanent deactivation of K-9. Trainer resigned voluntarily. Emily reread the line 3 times. Too vague, too carefully worded. But what caught her attention most was the final note on the file. Dog Shadow did not complete full training, deemed unsuitable for duty due to refusal to follow aggressive commands, but demonstrated exceptional ability to protect vulnerable subjects. Her heartbeat quickened. She crouched to meet Shadow's steady, jet-black eyes. "You didn't fail," she whispered. "You just refused to harm, and now you've come back. In your way." On the drive back to the hospital, Emily said nothing. Pieces were starting to fit together. A dog dismissed for not attacking the weak. A handler who quietly resigned after a concealed incident. A girl chained in a park, covered in old injuries, and only calm in the presence of that same dog. Shadow hadn't appeared by accident. He hadn't just wandered into Oakwood Park that day. He had returned to finish something left undone, either by instinct or by an unbreakable bond with a human soul. Emily looked at Shadow, sitting in the passenger seat. Sunlight glinted off his back, his coat gleaming black like midnight. But in his eyes, there was a strange clarity, as if Shadow didn't need to be guided. He was the guide. Back at the hospital, Claire was undergoing another session with Laura. Emily stood outside the observation window, watching. Claire still didn't speak, but she allowed Shadow to rest right beside her. Her hand gently stroked his chest, eyes still cloudy but less tremulous. Emily entered quietly, placed the printout on the table before Laura, and whispered, "We're not just looking at a rescue dog. We're looking at a soldier who never abandoned his mission." For the first time, Laura was silent for a long while before nodding. "Then let him keep fighting, in the way he chooses." From the day Shadow appeared beside Claire's hospital bed, the building felt like a different place. No longer just a corridor soaked in antiseptic and the urgent footsteps of nurses. It became a space where something was slowly, quietly being reborn. Fragile, wordless, but unmistakably alive. Claire didn't speak, but she began to draw. No one told her to. Laura, the kind and intuitive psychologist, had simply left a set of watercolors and blank sheets by the windowsill, as if leaving a door ajar for someone trapped in darkness to step through. And Claire did, one trembling fingertip at a time, through the slow, deliberate motion of a paintbrush. The first day, she painted a room with no windows, stained gray walls, empty yet echoing. On the second day, she drew a blurred figure, faceless, dragging a chain across cold cement. On the third day, she stared at the paper for a long while, then suddenly painted an antique wristwatch on the left wrist of the shadowy figure, painstakingly detailed, disturbingly precise. The hands read 417. No one knew why. But for Claire, every number cut like a blade across her dreams. Emily was the first to notice something deeper. Years of working in trauma recovery had taught her this. Real pain rarely comes in screams. It comes in sideways glances or a trembling line on paper. And this time, she sensed a deeper layer of memory surfacing. Not in conversation, but in muted, melancholic colors. Shadow seemed to understand, too. Whenever Claire drew something especially painful, a heavy cellar door, a crimson rope dangling from the ceiling, he didn't look away. No barking, no growling, just a quiet presence, his chin resting on her knee as if to say, no matter how dark the memory, you're not alone. And sometimes, when Claire painted the darkest lines, her tears would fall on the paper, and Shadow would gently lick her wrist, slowly, softly, as if wiping away a sorrow too deep for words. Emily couldn't stay passive. She decided to bring the drawings to Helen Marlowe, a seasoned art therapist who had helped countless trauma survivors find their voice through images. As Helen unfolded each page, the room fell silent. The woman in her 60s, silver-haired and eyes sharpened by a lifetime of seeing too much, lingered longest on the fourth drawing, the only one where Claire used red, a noose tightening around a blurred wrist just beneath the familiar wristwatch. "She's not just remembering," Helen whispered. "She's a warning. That's the voice of someone who can't scream." Emily's throat tightened. She pointed at the watch. "Does that detail look familiar to you?" Helen nodded. "Things like that don't show up by chance. That's an anchor, the link between memory and reality. If we find someone who owns a watch like that, we'll be staring into the center of her fear." When Emily left Helen's office, she sat in the car for a long time, hands resting on the wheel, eyes unfocused. In her mind, Ryan's image emerged again. That awkward smile, those eyes that never softened. And then she remembered Shadow's first reaction when Ryan entered Claire's room. Ears sharp, body tense, ready to block. Back then, Emily thought it was a protective instinct. Now she wasn't so sure. Shadow wasn't protecting by instinct. He was protecting from memory. At that same moment, back in the hospital, Claire was finishing a new drawing. This time, there were no people, just a dim backyard, scattered weeds and garbage, and a half-open cellar door. On the tiled ground near the entrance, a small black shape, a dog. No visible face, but the ears stood tall, and the eyes seemed to wait for someone to look back, remember, and speak a name. Claire laid down her brush, placed the paper aside, and turned toward Shadow, who rested with his head on the edge of her bed. For the first time, she spoke a whisper-like breath, "Shadow." And for the first time since he was found beside her in Oakwood Park, Shadow stood, padded softly to her, rested his head in her lap, and closed his eyes, as if to say, "I'm still here, I always have been, a living memory, and the one truth that had never been lost." The treatment room was still bathed in the gentle light of morning as Emily quietly stepped into the hallway, holding copies of Claire's drawings, each one a narrow doorway into a dark corner of memory she had never been able to voice. Under the soft yellow glow of the ceiling lights, Shadow walked beside her in complete silence, his steps light and measured, always close enough that she could feel him brush her hand when needed. Like a sentinel, not imposing, but always present. Just as they reached the ground floor, a phone notification flashed. "This is Marcus Riley, about Shadow. I need to talk." Emily froze. That name wasn't unfamiliar. She'd seen it on Shadow's chip registration. His former trainer, once a respected canine officer who had abruptly left the force after a non-disclosed incident. It seemed Shadow's past ran deeper than any report she'd ever held in her hands. She replied simply, "I'm listening." Seconds later, a video link arrived. A note beneath the title read, "The event that got him removed from the unit. Watch closely." Emily sat down on a bench in the hallway and opened the video with the guarded anticipation that someone who knows what they're about to see could change how they view someone forever. The footage was from a body camera worn by a trainer. The setting was a tactical training session in a simulated corridor. Smoke, mock gunfire, strobing lights, and shouted commands. Shadow, then not even 2 years old, was being tested in response to a hostage and attacker scenario. On command, he launched toward the designated target. But just as he was about to strike, he stopped cold. He had spotted something the humans hadn't noticed. In the shadows, a child, curled up, trembling. Not part of the drill, a real child. Emily guessed she was the daughter of a logistics staffer who had carelessly let her wander into the training zone. Without command, without hesitation, Shadow abandoned his target and approached the child. No barking, no alert. He simply lay beside her, gently licked her cheek, and curled around her like a warm shield. The video blurred just as the training alarm blared and the angry voice of a commanding officer shouted, "He disobeyed. Pull him from duty immediately." Emily put the phone down, her heart pounding as if she had just witnessed something sacred trampled beneath cold regulation. In a world governed by commands and conditioned reflexes, Shadow had done what humans too often forget, to distinguish between obedience and kindness, and the price he paid for that compassion was banishment, branded as unreliable and erased like an error from a perfect record. Moments later, Marcus called. His voice was low and gravelly, like someone who had waited far too long to be heard. "I can't forget that day," he began, "because it was the day I realized a dog could have a bigger heart than many people in uniform." Emily said nothing. She listened like a student to a lesson on the true meaning of loyalty. "I wrote a full report afterward," he continued, "said that Shadow saved a child, and his actions deserved honor, not removal. But they didn't want to admit a canine had broken protocol. They called him a failure. And I was suspended." "Did you try to find him?" Emily asked. "I did, but his records were locked. His name was erased, like they wanted him buried forever. I thought he was gone, until I saw that photo of him next to Claire on the news." Marcus paused. "He's not gone. He's still protecting. This time, a woman. And I think she needs us to believe her." Emily looked down at Shadow, now lying at her feet. His eyes were closed, but his ears were still raised, like he knew something important was finally being brought into the light. "I need to meet you," Emily said. "Claire, she's started to draw. Each picture is a memory trying to break the surface, but only with Shadow there does she feel safe. I think he remembers what we don't yet understand." "I'll come," Marcus replied. "I'll bring everything I have. Original files, old reports, even the video clip that never made it into the official record. If I have to testify, I will, for Shadow, and for Claire." When the call ended, Emily didn't move for a while. Her chest was tight, part fury, part the weight of realizing this story was bigger than she'd feared. That night, as Claire quietly worked on a new drawing, this time of a man in uniform, standing apart from a dog who had turned away, sorrow in both their eyes, Shadow rose, walked over and rested his head gently on her hand. Claire smiled faintly, for the first time since waking. She whispered, "You remember everything, don't you?" And in that moment, it became clear. Some memories don't need words, just an honest gaze, and a dog who never turned away from kindness. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the frosted glass of the therapy room, Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, one slender arm loosely wrapped around Shadow's neck. He lay still, unmoving, as though each of her breaths guided his calm. Emily, sitting a few feet away, noticed his ears twitch the moment footsteps echoed down the hall. No barking, no growling, just a sharp turn of his head, eyes fixed on the approaching figure, more alert than any seasoned security officer. The man approaching was a police officer. Tall, with cropped salt and pepper hair, and eyes that held not just fatigue, but a deeper weariness, regret. He wore no formal uniform, just a simple leather jacket and a badge clipped to his belt. He stopped at the door and nodded gently at Emily, careful not to disturb Claire's sleep. "Travis Morgan," he said quietly. "I've been assigned temporarily, replacing the former chief. I also worked alongside Marcus Reilly." Emily rose, slightly stunned. She had heard Marcus mention a former partner, one who'd worked child rescue cases. A man who'd lost something unspoken in a file with no conclusion. And now, he stood before her, part of the tangled mystery she was trying to unravel. Travis crouched and cautiously extended a hand toward Shadow. "If you're Shadow, you'll remember me. I saw you clear the spiral staircase drill. No canine had done it before. I never forgot." Shadow stared at him. No retreat, no leap forward. He studied Travis, then slowly circled behind him. finally resting his head gently against the man's back, as if acknowledging a familiar past. It wasn't a random gesture. It was recognition, reassembling a shared memory with someone who hadn't just commanded but had once listened. Emily smiled faintly. "Looks like he accepts you. At least Shadow believes you belong here." They sat down in a small conference room. Travis laid an old, yellowed envelope on the table. Inside were reports and photographs, sealed under brittle plastic. He pulled out a photo. A girl, maybe 8, eyes swollen from crying, clutching a stuffed bear. Behind her was a blurred figure, redacted for anonymity. "That girl," Travis murmured, "was missing for 2 weeks. When we found her, she wouldn't speak. But the drawings she made, they were almost identical to Claire's." Emily glanced at the sketches, a chill crawling down her spine. Stone walls, chains, and one image stood out. A silver-faced watch, round, on the left wrist, the same watch Ryan always wore. "The case was never prosecuted," Travis continued, voice tightening. "The mother dropped charges. The suspect was cleared for lack of evidence. I missed my chance to bring the truth out." He paused, then pulled another photo, this time of Ryan Bennett at a family gathering. On his left wrist, unmistakably, that same silver watch. "You know I'll need more than a feeling," Emily said quietly. "And I know I have to start over," Travis replied. "You're not the only one uneasy about Ryan. But now we have Shadow, we have Claire, and I won't let what happened to that girl happen again." Shadow stood, walked over to the table, and gently nudged the photo toward Emily with his nose. Not a trick. A message. Emily met his gaze. His eyes needed no words. They carried the quiet truth. The evidence is here, but someone must have the courage to face it. That evening, as Emily left the hospital, Travis walked beside her to the parking lot. Shadow trailed faithfully on her left like an old friend returned after a long, undeserved exile. Before parting ways, Travis said softly, like a vow, "He chose to trust me, and this time, I won't let him down." Shadow lifted his head and let out a low, quiet sound. Not a growl, a sigh. As if, after all the years of being dismissed, forgotten, and labeled a failure, he was finally allowed to follow his truest instinct again, to protect, to lead, and to bring the truth home for those who had stayed silent far too long. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the white curtains, casting faint beams across the hospital floor. In room 217, the air still carried the sharp scent of antiseptic and the chill of the air conditioner. Claire lay there, her figure small beneath the white layers of sheets, hair tangled across the pillow, eyes barely open, as if she hadn't yet decided whether she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare that had lasted for years. Across from her bed, Shadow sat in absolute silence, like a living statue. The German Shepherd, once branded insubordinate by the canine program, was now the only being capable of calming Claire when someone approached. He didn't bark, didn't demand attention. He simply existed, quietly, completely, as if he understood that just being there, in the right place at the right time, he was doing what no one else could, making sure she no longer felt alone. The door creaked open softly. Amanda stepped in with quiet footsteps, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile. In her hand was a neatly wrapped fruit basket, the crinkling of plastic unnervingly loud. She smiled at Claire, trying to inject some sense of normalcy into the air. "Sweetheart, I brought your favorite, fresh strawberries and butter cookies," Amanda said, avoiding her daughter's averted eyes. "They say you're getting better. That makes me so happy." Claire didn't respond. She kept staring at the ceiling, hands clutching the blanket. Then a deeper voice came from the doorway. "I thought maybe if Claire sees me, it might bring back something positive." Ryan stepped into the room, tall, composed in a gray coat, hair neatly parted, and the familiar silver watch glinting beneath his cuff. To an outsider, he still looked the part. Polite, measured, warm-eyed, the ideal stepfather. But to Shadow, the air shifted instantly. The moment Ryan crossed the threshold, Shadow sprang up. No bark, no snarl, just a tensing of muscles, shoulders raised, ears sharp, and an unwavering stare locked onto the man, precise, alert, and full of intent. Ryan took a few more steps, smiling. "Hi, Claire, sweetheart," he said, leaning down to rest a hand on the bed rail. That's when Shadow growled. Low, deep, quiet, but clean as a blade slicing into the thick tension of the room. "What's wrong with him?" Amanda flinched, pulling Ryan's arm back. "Probably just agitated by a stranger's scent." Ryan shrugged, still smiling, though his hand withdrew. But Shadow didn't move. He held his ground between Claire and Ryan, a living wall no one could breach. Then Claire turned her head. Not suddenly, not abruptly, but her eyes, for the first time since waking, weren't blank or distant. They were fixed on a point behind Ryan, as though piercing through him. Her lips trembled, her eyes widened, her body curled in on itself, as if flung backward into a place where darkness had no exits. And then, as though shards of memory collided and broke open inside her, she gasped out the first words from deep in her throat, hoarse, trembling, but clear as a bell dragged up from the depths of time. "Don't lock me in!" Emily, waiting in the hallway, burst in. Amanda stood stunned. Ryan's face went pale. Claire's breathing turned erratic, tears streaming unchecked, her body shaking violently, as though those 4 words had pulled her back into a wooden cell beneath the earth, where no one had heard her call. Shadow whined softly and placed his front legs on the bed. He pressed his body against Claire's, nose brushing her hand, tail tucked low, eyes gentle. No training, no command, just instinct. He knew she needed to be pulled back from the edge, from the void that Ryan's presence had reopened. Travis arrived as soon as he got the call. He entered just as Claire was starting to calm, wrapped in Emily's arms, Shadow still lying pressed beside her. He didn't speak. He just stared at Ryan, his gaze lingering on the silver watch, then turned to Emily. A single, subtle nod passed between them. This wasn't just about an emotionally unstable girl anymore. This was a warning shot, and the most undeniable sign yet that something terrible had been buried. Ryan left the room, attempting to maintain composure, but even after the door shut behind him, Shadow remained at the bedside. He didn't move an inch. He didn't need orders. He didn't need praise. But in every breath, every look, every still posture, he had assumed the role no one gave him, keeper of memory and guardian of the truth finally beginning to surface. Once Claire had calmed, she reached out and touched Shadow's ear, a soft, barely there gesture. But Shadow tilted his head and lowered his eyes as if to say, "You've found your anchor. It will never betray you." And this was only the beginning. By the time the first light of morning brushed the hospital windows, Travis was already waiting outside. Claire's painful awakening, paired with Shadow's instinctive reaction, hadn't just triggered buried memories. It had ignited a sense of urgency. This wasn't a vague hunch anymore. Something had happened in Ryan's house. And now Travis needed proof. Emily arrived hurriedly, temporary investigation documents in hand. "I got civil support authorization," she said. "We can't enter outright, but if we find signs of abuse or endangerment, the chief of police can invoke Regulation 14B for emergency inspection." Travis nodded. "We don't have time." He knows Claire spoke. They headed to the quiet, suburban neighborhood where Ryan and Amanda lived. The garden was immaculate, the lawn perfectly trimmed, like a home lifted from a catalog. But that pristine facade made Travis even more suspicious. In his experience, the more manicured the surface, the more carefully hidden the rot beneath. They circled to the rear, where a row of low shrubs bordered a stretch of old brick, the only remnant of the original house blueprint Marcus had shown them the night before. Travis pried open a small kitchen window and slipped inside, Emily close behind. The air was thick with dampness, old and stale. Amanda had been escorted out earlier under the pretense of a welfare hearing. Ryan, according to her, was off on a weekend hunting trip in an undisclosed location. Emily peeled back a small rug near the side staircase. Beneath it was a tiled floor, unremarkable, save for a faint L-shaped crack, nearly worn flat. But Travis, a seasoned investigator that he was, knew not all doors had handles. He tapped along the tiles with a metal rod, until, on the third corner, the sound turned hollow. They inhaled in unison as Travis pried up a loose tile, revealing a hidden handle embedded beneath. A trap door. They pulled it open to reveal stairs descending into a basement, a level never marked on the current blueprints. No lights, no smell of blood, but the air was colder than normal, the suffocating kind of cold that came from a space sealed for months but never truly abandoned. Travis went first, flashlight at the ready, his sidearm holstered but within reach. Emily followed, scanning the walls with thermal imaging. Every inch mattered. At the base of the stairs, what they saw was worse than blood. The walls were lined with acoustic foam. Amateur, but effective. Not for storing tools, not for wine, but for hiding sound. On the concrete floor, a semicircular dent had been patched over with mismatched cement. Cracks still bled from the repair. Emily's flashlight swept upward, catching a small rusted hook in the ceiling. Not fresh, but unmistakably used. Its shape still bore the weight of something once hung there. No words were needed. Each detail spoke louder than any confession. Claire had been held here, in silence, in the dark, with no help coming. In a far corner, Travis knelt and retrieved a piece of silk, yellowed but still faintly scented, jammed into the brickwork, hidden, or perhaps forgotten. "This is enough to bring him in," Travis said, eyes still fixed on the ceiling hook. He called for forensics and ordered the property sealed. Hours later, Ryan was summoned under emergency procedure. When he walked into the interrogation room, his face showed no fear, only irritation, as though this were an inconvenient blip in his weekend plans. But Travis, for the first time in years, felt no hesitation. Back at the hospital, Claire still lay motionless, wrapped in silence. Shadow remained by her bedside, guarding every breath as if keeping her tethered to safety. Emily came in and placed a hand gently on Shadow's head. "You led us here," she whispered, eyes meeting his, not as a handler, but as a teammate. "And now it's our turn to finish what you started." Shadow lifted his head, eyes dark and deep as still water. No bark. He didn't need one, because now Claire was no longer alone. The sky had yet to fully brighten when the vehicle carrying Claire rolled away from the protected facility. The city was frozen in the early morning mist, as if even the air itself were holding its breath, bracing for something important. Inside the vehicle, Claire sat still, her eyes tracing the blur of trees through the foggy window. Beside her, Shadow lay with his head resting on her leg, his breathing steady, like a quiet rhythm anchoring a soul still finding its way. Emily sat in the front seat, not turning around, but watching Claire closely through the rearview mirror. She knew today was a turning point. Not because the court would render any final judgment, but because Claire would be speaking, for the first time, in her voice, to the world. The court convened an emergency hearing. No press, no noise, but all the essential people were present. The prosecutor, Claire's attorney, police representatives, and most notably, Ryan, her stepfather, sitting across the room, fingers intertwined, eyes unreadable, occasionally casting glances at Claire as if all of this were just one big misunderstanding. Claire entered the courtroom with her shoulders slightly hunched beneath a light brown coat. She paused before sitting. Only when Shadow stepped in behind her, lifting his head to scan the room, did she exhale softly and take her seat on the witness stand. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired but sharp eyes. She didn't speak much, just summarized the reason for the emergency hearing and invited Claire to speak. Not to testify, but to express what she wanted. The room turned to stone. Claire didn't look at anyone. Her eyes hovered somewhere mid-air, then dropped to the floor, where Shadow lay with his head between his paws, eyes upturned, waiting patiently, offering presence, not pressure. Claire's hand gripped the hem of her coat, then released it. Her voice was barely audible, but everyone lifted their heads. She swallowed and spoke again, this time clearer. I don't want to go back to that house. Not a sound followed. Even the court reporter paused as if to make sure she heard it right. I know this might seem sudden, but I need people to believe me, even if I can't say everything, Claire continued, still not looking at Ryan or the judge, only at Shadow, as if speaking to herself through the eyes of the dog who had never left her side. That place is not safe, not just because of what happened recently, but because, long before that, I was a child who wanted to disappear inside my own home, and I don't want to be locked inside those memories again. Her voice did not tremble. She didn't cry, but every word carried the weight of years spent imprisoned by invisible control. Freedom so false, it slowly erased who she was. Ryan shifted in his chair, about to speak, but the low, sharp growl from Shadow stopped him cold. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was a warning, a visceral read of Claire's rising heart rate and the invisible intrusion into her space. Police officers approached Ryan, one placing a hand gently on his shoulder in silent caution. Ryan clenched his jaw, eyes darkening, but said nothing. The judge nodded slowly. Ms. Bennett, thank you for speaking. Sometimes just one sentence is enough to be taken seriously. After a brief deliberation, the court declared, an emergency no-contact order is granted. Claire Bennett will be relocated to a secure residence under the supervision of the Witness Protection Agency and mental health professionals. Ryan Bennett is prohibited from all contact, in any form, until the full trial is convened. Emily closed her eyes for a second as the ruling was read, then turned and smiled gently at Claire, the girl who had just crossed a threshold many never managed to reach. Claire didn't smile back, but she leaned down and placed her hand on Shadow's head, her fingers lightly brushing over his soft ear. Not a pet, but a quiet thank you, rich with meaning. As they exited the courtroom, passing Ryan's row, Shadow stepped between Claire and her stepfather. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he just stood. His gaze met Ryan's with a message that needed no words. Your era of control ends here. As the car wound through the low mountains and left the city behind, the lights gradually faded from view. Claire sat quietly in the back seat, a thick blanket draped over her narrow shoulders. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't protest. Her silence was no longer fear. It was the long, weary exhale after a storm. Someone too tired to be afraid, simply wanting to drift. Beside her, Shadow sat upright, eyes scanning the roadside, ears twitching now and then at unseen movements in the dark. The lakeside cabin at Lake Champlain had been chosen for the first stage of Claire's protection. Hidden deep within a forest of changing maple leaves, the little wooden house looked like a memory from a gentler time. Old mossy shingles, a creaky wooden porch, and a gray stone fireplace. The scent of pine, damp soil, and fresh water filled the air with a vague sense of safety, as if time itself slowed in this place. When the car stopped at the edge of the gravel path, Shadow was the first to step out. Not in haste, but with deliberate calm. He sniffed the air thoroughly, ears up, scanning for threats. Emily opened the rear door and helped Claire out. Claire said nothing, but her eyes moved around. Tall trees, the silent lake, no signs of people. Everything seemed to whisper a promise of peace. Shadow turned just as Claire reached the porch, and their eyes met in a quiet exchange. This place is far enough. You can breathe here. That first night in the cabin, no one went to bed early. Claire sat by the fireplace, a blanket across her legs, rubbing her hands together to keep warm. Emily busied herself in the tiny kitchen, boiling water and preparing a small meal. At Claire's feet, Shadow curled into a ball, eyes wide open, watchful. Not like a pet, but like a guardian stationed at the border between safety and the past, trying to break through. When the fireplace glowed warm and steady, the flickering light danced across the wooden walls like shadows slipping through. Claire stared into the flames, then closed her eyes. She was trying to grasp something. A memory, a sound, or perhaps just the warmth filling the hollowness in her chest. Outside, the forest had gone still. The wind rustled faintly through the leaves, the kind of sound you only notice when the world is quiet enough to remember it's alive. Claire went to bed earlier than usual. She entered the small back bedroom, window facing the lake. The moon was unusually bright that night, casting a soft glow across the water. She climbed into bed and pulled the blanket to her chin. Shadow had already entered. He leaped onto the mattress without needing to be called. He lay down beside her, not pressing his head against her, just letting one side of his body touch hers, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, steady and real, a living clock, ticking down nightmares. The night passed slowly, as if time were walking softly across the creaky floorboards. Claire dreamed. In the dream, she was running, toward something or away from something she didn't know. There were dark walls, dim lights, someone's hand grabbing hers from behind, frantic breathing in her ear. Her heart pounded so hard that the dream became noise. She screamed, but the dream didn't fade. Then, something warm touched her hand. Light, so light, she jolted upright. Moonlight shone through the window. Beside her, Shadow was there, resting his nose on her hand, his eyes full of understanding. No bark, no panic, just presence. Claire met his gaze, and a tear slid silently down her cheek. Not from fear, but from knowing she wasn't alone. The next morning, Emily woke later than usual. She stepped onto the porch and found Claire already there. A cup of tea in hand, hair still messy, face softened by something quiet. Like someone returned from a long, long dream. Shadow lay at her feet, head resting on her slippers. Morning sunlight brushed his gray fur like a veil of light. "Did you sleep last night?" Emily asked gently. Claire nodded. Then, after a pause, as if choosing each word from a fragile, hidden place, she whispered, "I dreamed." But this time, Shadow was there. Nothing more needed to be said. In that quiet statement was a thank you, a beginning, and a quiet miracle. Sometimes a creature who cannot speak hears the smallest cries of a soul trying to survive. The atmosphere at the lakeside cabin on Lake Champlain seemed still, but something was subtly shifting in the smallest of details. A leaf lingering longer than usual on its branch, seagulls flying lower across the water, and shadows barking. Not loud, not persistent, but timed just right, like a silent alarm sounding only for those truly listening. Claire began to realize it wasn't a coincidence. From the third morning at the cabin, Shadow started behaving differently. He no longer asked to go far into the woods, but would often stop at a particular spot, with a view of the trail that led down behind the lake. Each time he would stand still for a few minutes, sniff the air, and then turn back, his eyes fixed on something invisible between the trees. Claire noticed but didn't ask. She still kept her habit of staying quiet, letting feelings speak instead. And those feelings were becoming sharper, like a sixth sense awakened. That afternoon, when Emily returned from town with some supplies, she sensed something was off the moment she parked. Fresh tire tracks imprinted on the damp earth, not matching hers or Travis's. She called Travis immediately. Less than an hour later, the sheriff showed up with a compact drone and a thermal camera. He, Shadow, and Claire swept the area around the cabin. Under the drone's lens, a dark SUV appeared clearly in the blurry heat signature, parked about 200 meters away behind a stand of maple trees. The engine was running. Lights off. Waiting. Quietly. Deliberately. Travis gritted his teeth and said under his breath, "He's not just watching. He's measuring our reactions." Shadow stood beside Claire, The fur on his back raised. A low, deep growl came from his throat. Not fear, but alertness. And maybe a simmering rage. By the time they moved in to check, the SUV was gone. But it wasn't the disappearance of the vehicle that made Travis frown. It was what had been left behind. A length of rusty metal chain, placed right under a tree near the cabin, with one end hooked and bent, as if it had once been violently yanked. Claire saw the chain, and instinctively stepped back. She said nothing, but her shoulders trembled. Shadow immediately stepped forward, placing himself between her and the object, not barking, not reacting beyond what was necessary, just holding a position of perfect protection, as if he understood that some things don't need words, only presence. "This isn't just a threat," Travis said, his voice low and tight. "It's a message." He checked the cabin's security cameras. One clip showed a grainy image, a tall man in a baseball cap, appearing at 3 a.m. on the edge of the woods, standing silently, staring at Claire's window, then vanishing in under a minute. Travis zoomed in. The man was holding something heavy in his hand. A chain. Travis didn't need further proof to be sure. It was Ryan. The license plates were fake. The stealth, the hidden cameras, the knowledge of the cabin's layout. It was all the mark of a plan long in the making. "We're no longer in the defensive phase," he said as he returned to the cabin. "We go on the offensive." Emily nodded. But it was Claire who spoke first. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said, slowly but firmly. "But I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Not Emily, not Shadow, not any other child." The room fell silent. Shadow stood next to her, his head slightly lifted as if he could feel the strength in her voice. Not trembling, but steady. It was the first time Claire used the word "I" to refer to herself in front of others, and the first time she spoke of the past as something that belonged to her, no longer denied or avoided. That night, Travis stationed a small undercover team around the cabin and connected the security system directly to the town sheriff's office. But more than any alarm or patrol, what no one dared to say out loud was this: Shadow was Claire's strongest line of defense. While everyone slept, the dog never moved from his post by the glass door. His ears were tilted, his eyes open, his gaze sharp as steel, yet incredibly calm. It wasn't just trained instinct. It was a loyalty forged in the deepest place, one that fear or darkness could never bend. And in that quiet cabin, amid the chirping insects and gentle lake waves, something had changed. It was no longer just an escape. It was the start of a quiet resistance, driven by the loyal heart of a dog who led the way in silence. Just as the nights by the lake began to feel safe again, just as Claire started to breathe easily in her sleep, comforted by the sound of Shadow's soft footsteps on the porch, the calm shattered on a gray afternoon. The sky was overcast, the lake still to the point of chill, and Claire discovered that Shadow was gone. At first, she assumed he had wandered to the forest edge as usual, where the wild birds often landed near the tall weeds. But when she called, once, then twice, there were no footsteps returning, no familiar wet nose nudging her hand, only a silence so eerie it chilled her. "Emily," she called out, her voice breaking. The two of them searched the entire cabin area. Travis arrived in under 10 minutes with 2 patrol officers. The security cameras, discreetly placed throughout the woods, had all gone offline at exactly 3:08 p.m. The feed cut sharply, as if someone knew exactly how to disable the system in seconds. It couldn't have been random. The small GPS collar Shadow always wore, for tracking, sent its last signal less than 500 meters from the cabin. There, they found deep scratch marks on the ground, a few black tufts of fur caught under a bush, and unfamiliar tire tracks veering north, toward a place no known trail had ever led. Claire nearly collapsed when she saw the collar lying under dry leaves. Her hands shook, gripping her shirt as if to keep her heart from bursting out of her chest. "We'll find him," Travis said, trying to reassure her, though his voice was heavy as stone. "He's hitting Claire right where it hurts most." Emily gripped Claire's shoulder. Her eyes were no longer those of a caseworker, but a sister, ready to become a mother if needed, to protect. Marcus arrived that evening. After seeing the collar and the sabotaged cameras, he didn't need to guess further. "He wants control back," Marcus said. "He knows Shadow is the only thing letting Claire live freely. Take him away, and that door shuts." He bent down, gently brushing the few remaining hairs. His eyes held something close to breaking. Shadow would never let himself be taken, unless he chose not to fight to protect someone else. That made Claire lift her head. Her eyes were brimming, but steady. In all the days they'd spent together, Shadow had never growled or panicked. Even when starved, threatened, or faced with strangers, he was calm. But when Ryan appeared, that calmness became fierce protection. Shadow didn't react like an animal trained to obey, but like a soul that chose to sacrifice. "I think he went with him," Claire said, her voice cracking but sure. "To lead him away from me." No one responded, because no one needed to. Travis immediately mapped out the last GPS location and started a search along an abandoned trail from the 1970s. They discovered a makeshift camp in the forest, recently dismantled. An old cloak lay there, with traces of dried blood and a familiar scent, the warm smell of dog fur that made Claire break down. But the most painful part wasn't the blood. It was the loss of the steady heartbeat that had once pulled her from the darkness. The cabin fell into a terrible silence. Claire couldn't sleep. She called Shadow's name in her dreams. She dreamed of being back in the cellar. But this time there was no paw, no bark, no one pulling her out. Just the sound of chains in the dark. Not freedom. But Claire's belief never faltered. The next morning she looked straight at Marcus, her hand gripping the GPS collar. "You once said Shadow never resists when he knows what matters," she said. "I believe he's alive, and I want to find him." Travis moved to stop her, but her eyes, clear, unshaken, made him pause. "He helped me survive," she said. "Now it's my turn to live and save him." Emily nodded slowly, and that was when a small team, Claire, Marcus, Travis, and another canine unit, began the journey into the dark, not just to rescue a dog, but to reclaim life for two souls chained too long by fear and evil. As the afternoon dimmed in the forest, a cold mist crept up from the lake like silent fingers of old memories. Claire sat motionless on the steps of the cabin. In her hand was Shadow's GPS collar, no longer sending signals, and beside her, a phone had just received a voicemail, the sender's name hidden. She glanced at Emily, who had fallen asleep on the chair, her face still furrowed with worry even in rest. Travis was still outside on the porch, scanning the terrain map under the beam of his headlamp. Everyone was tense, but none of them knew what Claire was about to do. The recording began with footsteps crunching dry twigs, followed by a voice. Low, dry, controlled. If you still remember the smell of iron chains, if you still hear the sound of locks in your head, then you know where to go. I don't need you forever, Claire. I just want you to know you've never escaped. If you want that dog to live, come to where I taught you what fear is. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She quietly pulled out a small piece of paper and wrote on it with her left hand, the one dislocated as a child from being yanked too hard. She wrote, Old Factory District, south of town, abandoned textile mill. She left the note on the table, next to an unfinished sketch, a metal door with a chain hanging down, and in the darkness the glowing eyes of a dog, not fierce, but watchful, waiting. Then she stepped out, slipping on Marcus's old windbreaker and leaving her shoelaces loose as if knowing she'd need to move in silence through hell. She didn't wake anyone, didn't bring her phone, only carried a small pocket knife Marcus once left behind, and a hastily printed photo from the first time she and Shadow were captured together. Her silhouette disappeared into the woods, swallowed by whistling winds and a moonless sky. Inside the abandoned textile mill, where dust coated every groove of the crumbling walls like time no one dared to touch, Ryan stood alone on the shattered tile floor, holding the familiar chain. At the end of that chain, Shadow was no longer there. But he knew Claire would come, because her love for that dog was stronger than her fear of him. He smiled coldly, placing a small speaker in the middle of the room. That recording was only part of a psychological game he had rehearsed for years. Every time Claire escaped, he found a new way to remind her that every exit had been placed by him. Every piece of freedom was just a mirage behind a door he still controlled. And now, love itself was the leash he used to pull her back. Claire arrived near midnight, her breath shallow amidst the screeches of rusted steel and creaking beams. She didn't bring a flashlight, only the pale moonlight trickling through cracks in the tin roof. But she remembered every step in that darkness, where she'd once been dragged, once lain motionless for hours just for stepping out of line. A soft growl echoed from behind a partition. Claire froze, eyes wide. It wasn't a human voice, it was Shadow. Muzzled, lightly tugging at his chain but still recognizing her scent, and though restrained, he didn't bark, as if trying not to alert Ryan that she had arrived. Claire crept closer. The glow of Shadow's eyes in the dark was her only guide through the maze of terror she now walked. She crouched, gently touching his back, matted with mud and the smell of sedatives. But when her fingers brushed his skin, he flinched and let out a faint whimper, his eyes pleading. "Don't stay long. He hasn't left." In that instant, a sharp clang rang out behind her. Claire turned. Ryan emerged from the hallway, flashlight blazing, a mocking smile on his lips. "So you finally came back," he said, voice calm, like greeting a long-lost relative. But Claire didn't step back. For the first time, her gaze didn't waver. She reached for the chain, then pulled out the small knife hidden in her sleeve. Without a word, she sliced through the metal leash, holding Shadow. Quick and clean. He flinched for a second, then sprang forward to shield her, fur bristling, eyes blazing. Those eyes no longer belonged to a captive animal. They were the eyes of a warrior, protecting the only soul who had ever saved him through love alone. And Claire, for the first time, stood upright beside him, no longer bowing as she had in the past. "I didn't come back," she said, voice soft but sharp as steel, echoing through rust and silence. "I came to end this." As the darkness swallowed the roads leading back to the old mill, the place once called her Fear School. A cold wind swept through the trees, rippling the lake nearby like the surface of her mind. Claire walked over the cracked concrete, her hand gripping the wrinkled note bearing the threat. "If you want him to live, come to where I taught you fear." Her heart pounded, but her eyes no longer trembled. Inside, only one thing mattered. Shadow was there. The rusty metal doors groaned like a sigh. Claire entered, her small figure consumed by darkness. The air was thick and damp, and somewhere in it she heard breathing, unclear if man or beast. But Claire knew. This was the place that once imprisoned her, chained her childhood to a nameless fear. Now she had returned to break it. A flashlight flickered from afar, and a voice rang out. "Didn't think you'd come alone. You're always that stupid, Claire." Ryan's voice bounced off stained, crumbling walls, each word a needle to her memory. Claire stood still. She didn't respond. Her presence was answer enough. "Give yourself to me and I'll let him go," Ryan said, shoving out a small iron cage. Inside, Shadow lay motionless, eyes wide but drained. A long gash cut across his shoulder. Blood dried, but the metallic stench lingered. Claire choked back a sob, whispering, "Shadow?" The dog stirred slightly, ears twitching at her voice. Though exhausted, his eyes lit up with gentle light, as if saying, "Don't be afraid. I'm still here." Ryan stepped closer, holding a chain in his hand. "You know what this is? It's what kept you quiet for 10 years. I can do it again, just as easily." Claire took a deep breath. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her gaze never left Shadow. At that moment, every time she had been tied down, threatened, every rattling lock, every sneer from the man who claimed to be her stepfather, faded into the clarity that Shadow's presence had always brought. "You're not going to touch anyone again," Claire said. Her voice wasn't loud, but unshakable. For the first time, she spoke not as a victim. Ryan laughed, the sound echoing like madness. He lunged at her, chain raised like a final blow. But at that moment, a thunderous growl split the air, and from the cage, Shadow surged forward, bursting through the loose door. In the heartbeat between Ryan's swing and his next step, Shadow leapt like an arrow. His body was bloodied, but eyes blazing, not with rage, but with absolute love that asked for no promises. The tackle threw Ryan to the ground. Claire screamed, rushing forward. But Shadow didn't bite. He only stood firm, snarling, blocking Ryan's path with his entire body, as if shielding her from the past that wanted to resurrect itself. Then came the piercing wail of police sirens outside, followed by rapid footsteps. Travis and Marcus stormed in, weapons ready, flashlight beams sweeping the scene. "Drop the weapon! Down on the ground now!" Travis shouted. Ryan struggled, but Marcus stepped in, grabbed his wrist and slammed him down. "You thought you'd get away this time?" Marcus said, his voice cold as steel. Claire stood still. In her arms, Shadow breathed heavily, warmth radiating from his chest to her skin like an electric current reviving every part of her once numb soul. "You did it, Shadow," she whispered, and for the first time in her life, she believed she could go on, not by running, but by standing her ground. Marcus bent down, gently stroking Shadow's back, and murmured, "Kid, you're a hero now." Travis gave Claire's hand a reassuring squeeze. "He won't hurt you again. This is over." Claire looked up, scanning the abandoned mill, once her hell, now the mark of her escape. Her heart beat stronger, not because fear was gone, but because she knew another heart, one on 4 legs with unwavering eyes, had walked through the darkness with her. A leaden sky hung over the town like a mourning shroud, but inside Claire, a different light had broken through. Not the relief of closure, but the piercing, painful light of truth finally unearthed. Ryan had been arrested, but what Travis and Marcus discovered in the abandoned basement told them one thing clearly. This was just the surface. In the interrogation room, questioned about the streaks of dried blood and the rusted chains, Ryan showed no remorse. On the contrary, his gaze remained disturbingly calm, as if, in his mind, people were possessions, and control was a kind of power no one could take from him. Travis, seasoned by years of facing every shade of criminal, saw it at once. Ryan wasn't alone, and to expose the full scope of the network behind him, they would need more than one confession. Emily returned to the social work office, carrying Claire's old case files. She combed through every intake form, every vague testimony. Small details, misaligned dates, questionable funding to care centers that had long drawn suspicion, now stood out like blaring red flags. She and Travis began connecting what once seemed scattered dots. A pattern emerged. Numerous young women, most from difficult backgrounds, had passed through private support facilities tied to Ryan, then were either relocated or went off the grid. One name sent a chill down Emily's spine. Rosa Alvarez, a Mexican woman who came to Vermont on a temporary work visa and then vanished without a trace. Her family had filed a report, but the case was closed swiftly due to lack of evidence suggesting foul play. Travis requested the file and found a key detail overlooked. The last GPS ping from Rosa's phone was near farmland owned by a shell company linked to one of Ryan's relatives. That afternoon, beneath pale sunlight, a police team searched the property, which had been disguised as a psychological rehabilitation camp. Shadow came too, not for legal reasons, but because Travis believed the dog sensed what people couldn't. And just as he expected, when they approached the main lodge, Shadow stopped abruptly. He lowered his body, growled low, and stared toward a side door obscured by metal mesh and ivy. After breaking the door, they uncovered a narrow passage leading to a basement. No light, no sound, only Shadow's heavy breathing whenever the stench of old blood hit his nose. In that frozen silence, they found Rosa. She had been kept in a small room, locked from the outside with a metal bolt. Her body was frail, but her eyes still burned with fire. When the flashlight shone in, she shielded her face by instinct, retreating into herself. But then, Shadow approached gently, lying down just beyond the doorframe. He didn't push forward, didn't demand anything. Rosa saw something different in him, unconditional softness. She burst into tears, not from fear, but because, for the first time, something had come near her without expecting submission. At the hospital, Rosa still hadn't spoken. She wrote instead. But when she learned Claire was there, she nodded. Their meeting took place in a quiet hospital room. No police, no lawyers. Just two women who had lived through the same nightmare, and a dog keeping quiet watch in the corner. Rosa held Claire's hand and wrote one line in her notebook. "I thought I was the only one." Claire couldn't speak. She simply tightened her grip and answered with her eyes. At that moment, the truth didn't need testimony. It was alive in what they had survived. Shadow, though he couldn't understand the words, stepped closer and gently rested his head on Rosa's lap as if to say, "You've come back to the world now." Rosa's statement, along with evidence from the basement, opened up a sweeping investigation. Ryan was no longer just a suspect in one woman's trauma. He was the key figure in an organized system of abuse and captivity, stretching across state lines and spanning years. Women once written off as runaways, rebels, or dropouts were now seen in a new light. A press conference was held where Travis officially announced a federal-level investigation. Emily stood behind him, eyes rimmed red. Claire didn't attend, but her name and Shadow's were spoken as the spark that lit it all. Not because they were victims, but because they broke the silence. And in every report and news article, the image of the solemn German shepherd sitting beside the woman he helped rescue became a symbol of unshakable loyalty. That day, Shadow was given a new title in the police records: Four-Legged Witness. The morning at the Lakeside Care Facility was as quiet as ever. A cold breeze wove through red-stained maple leaves, carrying the scent of burnt wood and distant birdsong. In room 204, Claire sat silently by the window, eyes fixed on the gray sky reflected in the still lake. Shadow lay curled at her feet, chin resting on his front paws, eyes half closed as if dreaming of something gentler than the silence between them. Claire hadn't spoken much since the preliminary hearing. She seemed caught between two worlds, one bound by shadows of the past, the other still blurred by uncertainty. And her only constant was Shadow. A knock, soft and tentative, broke the stillness. Emily looked up and saw the woman standing at the door. Her hand gripped the edge of her worn coat, eyes sunken from sleepless nights and guilt. Amanda. Claire's mother. No one spoke at first. Time compressed between the three of them, and the four-legged soul keeping quiet watch. Amanda stepped in, each footfall hesitant, as if the floor beneath her might crack. In her hands was a faded wool scarf, one Claire had knitted long ago, back when she still believed her mother was the safest place on earth. She sat in the chair beside Emily, but didn't take her eyes off her daughter. Claire didn't turn. She kept her gaze on the rippling lake. No anger, no forgiveness, just silence, the kind adults call composure. But for Claire, it was a wall built since age 13. "Claire," Amanda began, her voice hoarse, as if choking down 1,000 sleepless nights. "I know you don't need to hear anything from me anymore, but there are things I can't keep inside." Claire tilted her head slightly, still not looking at her. But Shadow lifted his head, eyes locked on Amanda. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a question. Are you truly ready to face this? Amanda clutched the scarf tighter, breath trembling. "I've known. I heard you cry at night. I saw the bruises you tried to hide. I saw the chain in the basement. I even placed my hand on the door. But I walked away." No one interrupted. Claire didn't flinch. She just blinked once. enough to show that pain had never become the past. "I was scared, Claire. I thought if I closed my eyes, it would all disappear. I let Ryan control everything because I was weak. And you paid the price for that cowardice." Only then did Claire turn her head. Her look wasn't accusing, nor was it soft. It was the gaze of someone who had sunk and survived, not thanks to anyone, but herself, and a voiceless creature who never left her side. "Then why did you stay silent during the investigation?" Claire asked, her voice raw and scraped from too many years of not trusting anyone. Amanda's knuckles went white. "Because I didn't know if I could trust myself anymore. I lied to myself for so long that when the truth stared me in the face, I was afraid of how big it was, how much it hurt. I was afraid you'd hate me." "You were right," Claire said quietly. Not loud, not cold, just so honest it stung. "I did hate you. But I realized I didn't hate you. I hated the woman who stood next to the man who locked me in the dark and did nothing." Shadow edged closer, resting his chin on Claire's lap. She stroked his head without looking away from Amanda, for the first time, not hiding. "Do you know who saved me?" Claire asked. "Not the police, not the neighbors, a dog. A dog who had no obligation to me. He stayed because he couldn't bear to walk away." Amanda couldn't hold back her tears, but Claire didn't let the emotion take over. She went on. "I don't need your apology. I don't need you to fix anything. I just need you to understand. If you want to be in my life from now on, you have to walk out of your fear." Amanda pulled a worn photo from her coat. In it, a young Claire hugged a stuffed cat while Amanda smiled behind her, hand on her daughter's shoulder. The photo had yellowed, its edges frayed, but Claire's eyes in it still held light. She placed the photo on the table and gently pushed it toward her daughter. "I'm not asking for a chance, just asking you to remember I never stopped loving you, even when I wasn't brave enough to protect you." The room froze in a long silence. Finally, Claire bowed her head, pressing her forehead against Shadow's. She closed her eyes. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she didn't turn her mother away either. In her heart, a door didn't open, but it wasn't locked anymore. Shadow sighed quietly, as if he'd sensed it before anyone else. He nestled closer to Claire's legs, eyes soft, watching Amanda rise slowly and leave in silence. No one hugged. No one sobbed aloud. But for the first time, Claire felt she could begin to rewrite her life, not from the mistakes her mother had made, but from this exact moment when she was strong enough to face it all, thanks to a dog who had never once betrayed her. Since the afternoon Amanda left the cabin, Claire had grown quieter than usual. But it was no longer the defensive silence of before. This was a different kind of quiet. Deep, composed, and incubating something beyond words. Emily noticed the shift in the way Claire painted. The strokes were no longer erratic, but calm, deliberate, and full of intent. The air inside the cabin seemed to slow with every brushstroke, each layer of color spreading like layers of memory being washed clean and reshaped by the same hands that had once been shackled by darkness. Shadow was always there, beside the easel. He didn't nudge, didn't demand. He simply stood watch. His somber eyes never left Claire, as if he understood that even though Ryan was behind bars, even though her mother had confessed, the real door to freedom would only open when Claire dared to redefine herself, using the one language she'd always trusted: painting. Then, one foggy morning, Claire got up unusually early. Emily woke with a start, sensing the shift before she even heard the soft footsteps in the living room. It wasn't fear, but a feeling that something was about to change. When she stepped out, she found Claire already seated before a blank canvas, her small hand gripping the brush so tightly her knuckles were pale. Emily said nothing. She stepped back to a corner, Shadow beside her, and they watched in silence. Claire began with black, not because it represented darkness, but because it was from there that she would pull herself out. The first strokes were chains, heavy, jagged, misshapen. Then came the image of a young girl kneeling, head bowed, frail hands clutching her shackled ankles. But within a few beats, the colors shifted, like memories suddenly rushing back in reverse. A dog appeared. Not fierce, like those battle mascots in movies, but a silent, lean, determined form. Its back arched as if gathering strength, its eyes locked on the chains, growling low. Claire painted each hair on Shadow's neck, as though each stroke was a heartbeat released from her chest. The climax of the painting is the moment Shadow shatters the chains. The rusted links exploded into hundreds of pieces, flying across the canvas. The girl lifted her head. The first light on her face didn't come from above, but from where Shadow stood, as if the dog was the light. Claire stopped after painting the girl's eyes. For the first time, she gave her character a look that was alive, not terrified, not hopeless, but quietly reborn. That look mirrored the moment Claire first felt Shadow's warm breath on her hand in that dark basement, on a night when no one came, and no one heard her call. When the painting was finished, Claire said nothing. She simply painted 4 white words in the lower corner. I was found. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. Do you want to share it? Claire nodded. The painting was photographed and posted to an online forum for abuse survivors. By the next morning, the post had gone viral. No one knew Claire's name, but hundreds, then thousands of comments flooded in. Strangers, women, children, even men who had survived abuse, wrote that they saw themselves in the girl in the painting, that they too had waited for a shadow, and now, at least, they knew they weren't alone. A local newspaper wrote, "Some dogs aren't born to serve as tools, but as doors that lead someone out of hell." The article garnered over 10,000 shares. No one was surprised when the image was chosen as the official poster for the state's domestic violence prevention campaign. That night, as the cabin returned to its calm, Claire sat beside Shadow, wrapping her arms around his neck. For the first time, she whispered aloud, "Thank you for finding me, when I couldn't cry for help anymore." Shadow gently rested his chin on her shoulder, eyes closed. No bark, no unnecessary movement, just a calm silence, one that seemed to understand that the painting wasn't just an ending to a long darkness, but the first door to Claire's rebirth, painted in the language of courage, beside the one soul who never left her. Not long after I Was Found spread across social media, Claire received a court summons for Ryan's final trial in Franklin County. Her painting had become more than a personal declaration. It was a communal voice, urging the justice system to act decisively. This time, Claire didn't need persuasion. She didn't look back, didn't avoid it, and didn't hide. She stood up like someone who'd been waiting for this day all along, just waiting for her heart to be strong enough to cross the line. On the morning of the trial, the Vermont sky was cold and gray, but outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered, holding printed copies of Claire's painting. They didn't chant, they didn't shout. They simply held up signs with the words, "You are not alone." As Claire stepped out of the police-escorted vehicle, Shadow walked right beside her, each step in sync, like a perfect companion. No leash, no command. All eyes turned to the dog with the sun-faded coat and eyes that looked older than his years. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick and heavy with silence. Ryan was brought in, cuffed, his gaze lacking the arrogance he once carried at the cabin. Maybe even he hadn't expected that the girl once curled in fear against a wall would now walk tall before a full court, head high, hand resting lightly on the head of the dog beside her, as if making a silent vow. Claire was called to the witness stand. Her voice was not loud, but clear. Not once did she hesitate. She recounted her story in a tone so steady, it felt surreal, like the worst had passed, and she no longer needed to strain to survive. She described the basement, the metallic smell, the endless nights, the feeling of stolen time, each fragment of memory pieced together like a second painting, painted with words, right in front of the jury. "There was a time he took me down there not out of rage," she said, but because he believed I needed to be retrained. But I never learned obedience. I learned how to hear myself cry in my head and how not to let it out. She paused, eyes drifting toward the front row where Shadow sat. Until one day, a creature came into my life, not asking me to be quiet or obedient. He just wanted me to be free. At those words, Shadow shifted slightly closer, brushing his body against Claire's legs. The jury fell into stunned silence. A few wiped away tears. Those who had worked with trauma survivors knew that public testimony isn't vengeance. It's a declaration from a soul that had once been locked away. After a day of deliberation, the judge delivered the sentence. Ryan was sentenced to 20 years in prison for unlawful imprisonment, abuse, and federal-level human trafficking offenses. Claire didn't cry. She didn't clench her fists. She didn't erupt in emotion. She simply stood, turned to Shadow, gently stroked his head, and whispered, "We won." As Ryan was led past the front row, Shadow never took his eyes off him. No growl, no attack. But the look, cold, deep, and resolute, made Ryan turn his face away. Some judgments aren't delivered by the court, but by the eyes of a creature who knows the difference between danger and safety. Immediately after, Travis took the podium before a sea of reporters. Amid flashing cameras, he declared, "We are reopening every domestic violence and missing persons case previously dismissed for lack of evidence." No more silence. And the first thing I learned, again, was from Shadow, that loyalty and instinct can sometimes tell the truth, louder than a file ever could. News outlets reported the trial as a turning point in how abuse and victim support would be handled. But beyond the headlines and the camera flashes, at a quiet corner of the courthouse lawn, Claire sat beside Shadow. She unwrapped the old cloth tied around his neck, the one she had fastened the day he saved her in the basement. She held it in her lap and whispered, "Today, I was the one protecting you." Shadow, as if understanding every word, nuzzled her hand gently, eyes half closed. Their long journey had brought them here. A girl who once lost her voice in the dark, and a dog once rejected from the canine program for refusing to betray his nature. Now, they hadn't just won a trial. They had reclaimed what once seemed lost forever. Trust, protection, and friendship are beyond all definitions. After the trial ended and the echoes of justice began to settle, Claire didn't return to the quiet peace others had once wished for her. Because in her heart, the door she opened with her testimony wasn't meant for her alone. It was to welcome other souls still waiting for a place to be heard, believed, and healed. And just as she was once found, it was now her turn, hers and Shadow's, to go searching. The therapy center was called Lantern Haven, a quiet retreat nestled on the forest edge near Lake Champlain, where tree shadows stretched across the wooden roof and wind wove gently through the hushed porch. Its handmade wooden sign read simply, "Where the light never goes out." Emily held the legal name on paper, but Claire was the quiet heartbeat behind every corner of the place. And at the center of it all was Shadow, now older, the fur around his muzzle tinged with gray, the very first figure every visitor met. He wasn't there as a disciplined canine or a symbol of command, but as a calm, four-legged friend who would gently nuzzle the hand of a trembling woman as if to say, "I know this fear, but I also know the way out." They didn't call Lantern Haven a rescue center or a clinic. Claire preferred the term a listening place, where art therapy was the primary language. Survivors were encouraged to express their emotions through color, texture, and form. And in every session, at least one dog was present. Shadow was the first, and the inspiration behind every therapy dog trained after him. No one taught Shadow how to heal. He just knew. One autumn morning, when a girl named Lila, a domestic abuse survivor from out of state, sat frozen before a blank canvas, clutching a brush but unable to paint, Shadow quietly approached. He didn't bark, didn't paw. He simply sat beside her, resting his head gently on her knee. His eyes seemed to ask, What will you paint your pain into?" A sob broke from Lila's chest. The next day, the canvas bore a semi-abstract painting of a dog opening the door of a darkened room. Emily later recounted the moment, eyes red. "He's not just Shadow, the shadow of the past. He's the light, the lantern for those who are lost." Soon after, Marcus donated a group of young dogs previously dismissed from canine programs. Dogs trained for obedience, now retrained for empathy and companionship. Travis helped install legal protections and security systems to ensure that everyone at Lantern Haven was safe. Survivors didn't just recover there. They stayed, built community, trained new dogs, taught painting, tended gardens, repaired fences, each act a piece of a past gently set into a better place. Claire still painted, but her work now bore less shadow. She began to experiment with yellows, deep reds, and greens. On a main wall inside the center, she painted a scene. In the forest, a girl sitting in the embrace of a large dog, surrounded by other women hand in hand, facing the rising sun. At the bottom, the words no longer read, "I was found," but, "Now I go to find others." And each time Shadow walked past that painting, he paused, lifted his head slightly as if checking a memory, then continued, slowly but steadily. Just like healing, never rushed, but always moving forward. After many mornings full of sunlight, where laughter had begun to replace sighs, Claire realized there was one small, meaningful thing she had forgotten to do for Shadow. Her silent companion, the one who walked beside her every day as if he had never once thought of leaving. She wanted to give him a symbol, not a badge, not a title, but something simpler, more personal, something like the way love is carried quietly in something worn close. So in the little wood shop beside the porch, where Claire usually framed her paintings, she began sketching a design for Shadow's new collar. It wouldn't be flashy or ornate, just a soft brown leather band, hand-carved with care. On it, she inscribed a line in small, quiet lettering, like a whisper from her heart. "The one who found me in the dark." She carved each letter with her father's old engraving knife, the only possession of his she had kept after all those lost years. Her hands were steady, but each motion of the blade carried a memory of the dark, of cold basement tiles, of days she believed no one would ever find her until those eyes, those deep brown eyes, appeared as if stepping out of an unfinished painting. The next morning, she called Shadow to the porch. He had been lying in the sun, ears twitching gently with each rustle of the leaves. As Claire sat down, Shadow came over on his own, lowering his head slightly, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Claire slipped the collar around his neck, adjusted the buckle, then rested her hand on his head, thumb stroking the fur between his ears. "Now you have a home too," she whispered. Shadow didn't move at first. He just looked up at her, eyes calm, a gaze full of assurance, as if he was saying, "And you've been home for a long time. In me." The collar nestled under his gray coat, fitting perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along. When Shadow stood and wandered toward the grassy field, where a group of women were painting and crafting, one of them, a young woman named Rosa, asked gently, "Claire, what does it say on Shadow's collar?" Claire smiled, but didn't answer right away. She watched her four-legged friend lean softly into the hand of a new arrival, a woman still trembling, her hands clenched tightly. And after just a few seconds, that woman began to breathe deeper, as if some part of the darkness inside her had just taken one step back. Claire turned to Rosa and quietly replied, "It's a thank you." No explanation was needed. Anyone who had looked into Shadow's eyes, who had felt him simply sit beside them in silence, understood that sometimes what saves us isn't loud words or dramatic gestures. It's presence, solid, patient, quiet, and never leaving. From that day on, the collar became a symbol at the center. Each dog, after completing its therapy training, received a similar collar, each one engraved with different words, written by the woman who had healed beside them. And as a final tradition, before the collar was buckled, each woman would sit beside her dog, place a hand on its head, and whisper something that only the two of them would understand. Ever since the collar had been fastened around his neck, something in Shadow seemed to shift. Not in his nature, for he remained calm, quietly protective, and observant, but in the aura he gave off. It was a nameless feeling, a kind of pure safety, as though anyone who stepped into the space he occupied could lay down a piece of their burden, even just for a moment. 1 week later, just as the center finished hanging its modest wooden sign, "The House Within the Light," their first guest arrived. She was in her early 20s, thin, her blouse wrinkled at the shoulders, and her eyes never lingered on anyone for more than 3 seconds. Her name was Lily. Lily said little. A social worker brought her in, and she sat curled up in the corner of the therapy room, her hands trembling even though it wasn't cold. Claire didn't ask questions. She too had once sat in silence like that, and she knew that what mattered most right now wasn't asking, but waiting. When Lily finally lifted her head, their eyes met. Claire simply smiled, unhurried, then sat in the chair across from her. She reached out, gently holding Lily's clenched hand, warm and feather-light. "You don't have to tell me anything," Claire said softly, her voice like a lullaby. "I don't need to know what you've been through, but I do know someone who can help." Lily blinked, her lashes fluttering like something fragile on the verge of opening. And then, the door creaked gently. Shadow stepped in without a sound. The early afternoon sun angled across the wooden floor, making his gray coat glow like warm ash. He walked slowly to Lily, stopping just in front of her. He didn't lick her hand. He didn't make contact. He simply waited. Claire let go of Lily's hand and whispered, "He won't come closer unless you're ready." Lily looked down, her gaze quietly scanning the creature before her. For a few seconds, all that stood between her and Shadow was the distance of an outstretched arm and a long, fearful past. But no one rushed her. No one counted down. All that remained was the unwavering, quiet presence of a dog who asked for nothing. And perhaps, for the first time in Lily's life, she felt what that meant. Moments later, Lily slowly extended her hand and placed her small fingers on the top of Shadow's head. Shadow didn't move. Only when she trembled slightly and whispered, "Is he here?" Component placement did the dog gently step forward, sitting down right beside her, lowering his head just enough for her to lean on if she wanted. Claire stepped quietly out of the room, closing the door with reverence, as if sealing in something sacred. Outside, the maple trees stirred gently, their leaves turning red and gold, just as hearts began to turn after being long frozen in pain. She walked to the garden, where Emily was tending the newly planted lavender, and whispered, "Shadow just saved another person." Emily didn't look up. She simply smiled, a smile of gratitude, not for a miracle, but for the belief they'd dared to hold on to, that love could still be passed on, from a creature once discarded to those who thought they had nowhere left to go. From that day on, Lily became part of the center. But that first day, she still called Shadow he, as if speaking of a mythical friend in a fairy tale. And for Shadow, no praise or title was ever needed. The weight of a small head resting against him in silence was the only reward that mattered. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled softly across the porch, the grounds of the center were bathed in a warm glow, reflecting off the lake beyond the maple trees. The brush whispered against the canvas in a slow, steady rhythm. Claire sat on the old wicker chair, hair falling loosely over her shoulders, her hand gliding gently, each stroke reconnecting fragments of memory that had long been healed. This time, her painting showed no basement, no chains, no distorted shadows, only a small house nestled in the forest, where a girl stood beside a dog, and in the background people approached slowly, quietly, but no longer afraid. Next to her, Emily leaned against the wooden doorway, a book open in her lap, but her eyes were lost in the horizon, watching the trees sway in the autumn breeze. She didn't need to read. Everything she had ever believed about hope, about healing, now breathed in this space, built from love, from patience, and from a creature once rejected for being too gentle. And between them, lying quietly like part of the porch itself, was Shadow. His dark gray fur moved gently with each breath. His golden brown eyes were half closed, but his ears stayed perked, as if listening to some invisible music playing deep in the earth. Light footsteps, the rustle of leaves, or maybe even the shaky breathing of a newly arrived soul who wasn't yet sure if they deserved love. Claire put her brush down and glanced at Shadow. He was dreaming. Perhaps of the woods, of the first night he found her in the basement, or maybe of a little girl who once clung to him like life itself. In the dream, he didn't bark, didn't growl, just breathed softly, occasionally twitching as a gnat passed over his back. Then suddenly, a breeze stirred. It wasn't strong or cold, just enough to make the wind chime above the porch, sing a soft, clear note. Shadow opened his eyes. His ears lifted and his body tensed slightly, like a sentinel sensing something outside the visible boundary of their home. But he didn't leap up. He didn't bark or charge forward. He simply sat, silent, steady, looking toward the trail that led into the woods, where a new figure was emerging. A woman, new to the center that week, still with shaking hands and averted eyes. But this time, something was different. She was holding a scruffy little dog by her side, its fur tangled, its eyes mirroring the very same way, aching hope that Shadow once carried. Claire followed his gaze and, instinctively, smiled. A smile of peace, of gratitude. Because she knew Shadow's work wasn't done. More would come. More doors would need to open. But as long as there was a creature willing to stand among the broken and never walk away, the world could still be stitched back together, with the love we once thought we'd lost. Emily reached over and placed her hand gently on Shadow's head, stroking from brow to spine the way she used to when Claire was small. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Shadow didn't turn around. He simply continued watching the wooden gate slowly open, not to leave, but to let someone in. And at that moment, in the soft gold of fading light, no one saw a discarded canine dropout, a creature once chained in a basement, or a misfit labeled unfit to serve. They saw a gatekeeper, the final sentinel, sitting quietly at the threshold of new lives. No sirens, no medals, just being there, right place, right time, so that love could find its way home. In a world where the past can leave wounds too deep for words, some beings step into our lives, not asking, not demanding, just staying. Silent, steady, guarding our hearts until we're strong enough to rise on our own. For Claire, Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the silent witness to a wounded girl's lost years, the only friend who stayed when all else walked away. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was proof of something real, that even late-blooming love can still heal what once felt beyond saving. And what about you? Have you ever met a creature who saved you simply by being there? Share your story in the comments. If this story touched you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to remember they are worthy of love. And subscribe so you don't miss the next journey of healing. Because somewhere out there, another shadow is still waiting to be found.